Hey there everyone, welcome back to another video, and today we are going to be going through my top 5 least favourite First Doctor stories. Now this is obviously a sequel to my top 5 favourite First Doctor stories, link to that up above, and like what I said in there, this was really a lot of Doctor Who just trying to find itself, you know. These stories are all, you know, with the exception of William Hartnell's last 2 stories, these all came within the first 3 seasons of the show, and because of that, it really hadn't properly found itself, so yet again there is quite a range of quality. And really my enjoyment of these stories is based more on whether they fit in with Doctor Who or my vision of it, more than anything else. Because of course this all goes down to personal preference, and this is all just my own opinion, so let me know down in the comments below whether you agree, whether you disagree, and what your least favourite First Doctor stories are down below. But before we go through them, let's go through my honourable mentions, and today they are the Sensorites, the Ark, and the Crusade. And with that all said and done, let's get into the video. Spoilers ahead, enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, we have another guilty pleasure. This is just quintessential 60s Doctor Who, like, I don't want to say, yes, it's incredibly dated, incredibly cheap, very drawn out, very cheesy, yet there's something that's so charming about the Web Planet that I can't really describe. I think one of the major parts of it is that the cast at this point is so damn likeable. We've got the First Doctor probably at his best, we've got Ian, Barbara, we've got Vicky, and the dynamic that the TARDIS team has, the interactions with each other, it's just so entertaining to watch that even though we are watching a really bad story, I don't really care. And yeah, the story is really stupid. There's a lot of wasted potential in terms of some of the plot elements and the ideas that go into this. It's filled with a lot of very far-fetched plot lines there, and the pacing is incredibly slow, even for First Doctor Who. The effects and the production value, I think it goes without saying. Like, yeah, it just doesn't look great. I don't think it's helped by some kind of weak direction going on in this story. The effects are pretty laughable at this point now, so I can't really take the story seriously, but honestly, the actors and the writers, they're really trying, and there's something in that I see, but it just all falls apart. The Web Planet, yeah, it's very classic Doctor Who-y, very cheap, very dumb in several elements, but there's just a charm that comes from the dialogue and from the actors that makes it still quite watchable. At number 4 we have a bit of a hot take, because from what I know, people quite like the Aztecs, but sorry, I'm not one of them. I really don't like this story. For starters, I feel like it's ridiculously contrived. Like, everything has to have an extra thing going on in it and complicating it. For the sake of basically extending the runtime of this story, or rather making it an actual story, there are a lot of, you know, characters with big names, and it just blends together to be quite hard to follow sometimes. The storytelling itself is quite predictable, so they use a lot of these contrivances to try and make the story feel smarter than it actually is, but it just feels overlong, and because of that it's a bit of a bore. The whole story, it has good links to history, I'll give it that, but it feels like it's pulling its punches with a lot of the parts of history that it's going through, and because of that it just feels a bit insincere. If this was a story fully about learning about the Aztecs, then I'd be okay with that, but it's not really about that, it's more about a surface level of that stuff, and that just makes a lot of the storytelling dull. It's a very generic story that lacks a lot of scale to it, and granted, that is because this is 60s Doctor Who, I will give it that, but it lacks vision more than anything else. It lacks a good story. Even though Season 2 is my favourite First Doctor season, it does not get off to the best start. Planet of Giants maybe is an unpopular opinion, I don't really know, but this story just didn't really click with me. For starters, the cliffhanger that was leading onto it ended up being quite disappointing. It's a bit of a lie, it's not really a story to do with giants. It's kind of just a Doctor Who version of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Because this was made in the 1960s, you can bet a lot of the effects haven't aged particularly well. This does feel quite pantomime-y at some point, and with that you can expect. This episode has a very generic plot, some really cookie-cutter characters and ways of telling its story. Nothing really happens here. It's kind of just characters wandering around and talking to each other, and because of that the direction feels fairly lazy. This story just doesn't have a lot of energy to it. And whilst, you know, I appreciate some of the acting here, I appreciate some of the set design, there just isn't much to say about this story. It's very plain, it's very dull, it's very forgettable, and even though it has an interesting concept, it sort of throws that away immediately in the favour of something more digestible, which ultimately is what garners Planet of Giants its place in the bottom 3. Well, I'm surprised that this has only happened once so far, but I'm unfortunately going to have to talk about one of those stories that doesn't actually have any existing footage, so I'm going to use completely unrelated footage while talking about the Mythmakers. And really with the Mythmakers, the main thing that I dislike about this story is that it started a trend in Doctor Who, and that trend is a really frustrating one of the TARDIS crew member, usually female, falling in love with a character in a story and choosing to leave the TARDIS crew in that same story. And very often it feels very forced, or it doesn't feel earned, and in this case it really doesn't. The chemistry between Vicky and whatever the guy's name is didn't feel very well developed, and the choice for her to leave, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. It's clear they kind of just wanted to write Vicky out of there. And another choice that feels quite out of left field is the introduction of Katarina and her joining the TARDIS crew, something that, as it turns out, wouldn't be a problem for too long. The TARDIS was actually very busy this episode. We had a companion departure and a companion addition, and neither of them felt like they made any sense. Granted, this story has some good moments, but this all feels quite dry in terms of its character interactions. It feels sort of soulless and like the story was just building towards certain points it needed to get to rather than really developing on its own. The script is very uninteresting, and there's some pretty shoddy acting in this story, which is a shame. What Doctor Who can do is it can take the most obscure historical events and make them something interesting, but in this case they really couldn't, which is a shame because from what I've seen of the telesnap moments, the production design is pretty solid in this, and it even looks like there are some decent sequences here. Unfortunately, it's very much a mixture of the writing, the acting, and the directing that let it down. And like I said, the choices to add and remove companions out of left field, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. The best thing about this story looks to be its visuals, but that's the exact problem. This is telesnaps, so the visuals don't really exist, which is a shame. Maybe one day we can get an animation that fixes a lot of elements of this story, but ultimately this story is really bogged down by the fact that the visual spectre just isn't there for a story like this, and it becomes more apparent that a lot of the acting and the script writing just wasn't there for this story. And the worst First Doctor story is one that even an animation couldn't save. Galaxy 4 is so long. I know it's only 4 parts, but it just feels so overly long and stretched out. But unlike other Doctor Who stories, there just isn't anything interesting going on. We've seen pretty much everything that goes on in this story happen before this and after this, and it's been done better pretty much every single time. The dialogue in this story is really weak, and sometimes it doesn't even fit the characters of the companions that the Doctor is with. The sound design is really repetitive, I find, and the production design's also pretty dull. A lot of the direction is flat, and yeah, it's 60s production design, but that's not an excuse for some of the stuff here. But honestly, I could forgive the fact that this story looks cheap if the plot was good. But unfortunately, it isn't. The story is very boring, it feels very unoriginal, and with that, nothing really comes from the story. Like, what's the big thing that the story has to say, or the big aesthetic it has to give? And the answer is, there isn't one. This story's been done before, and it's been done again since, and yeah, it's been done better in Doctor Who. For the sin of being ungodly boring, for being very predictable and incredibly forgettable, Galaxy 4 is the worst First Doctor story. But hey, that's my side of things. So let me know down in the comments below what you thought of this list. Did you agree? Did you disagree? Let me know down there. Be sure to check out my other Doctor Who videos if you haven't already, because I'm afraid this is the end of this one. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.